Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 273, and welcome back because I'm back from my 2-week research break, rested and ready. And today I'm going to talk about this tremendous record by Herbie Nichols, the Prophetic Herbie Nichols volumes 1 and 2, basically the contents of two 10-inch records which were recorded in 1955 for Blue Note, and they've all been combined on one LP, and the sound quality doesn't suffer too greatly. This isn't quite at the level of some of the recent Tone Poet, Kevin Gray remasters, but it's still pretty darn good. It counts very much in that category of great Rudy Van Gelder recording. You could, I suppose, put it under the general rubric of hard bop. Certainly the era fits, but Nichols himself was somebody who drew on a whole variety of influences, and he himself, although black, was not actually from the Deep South, or at least his family was not, so he doesn't come from that blues-based tradition. His parents were actually from the Caribbean, and they were recent immigrants to the United States when he was born. The music on here has a lot of unconventional, surprising elements. His left-hand bass lines on the piano, I think, are unique, and his soloing is not so much, well, let's just take the chord changes and then extemporize wildly. It's a lot more closely tied to the melody with a variety of variations, such that the difference between head arrangements as such and soloing are a little bit unclear at points, which is another reason why this is distinct and interesting relative to a lot of jazz from the same period. As I mentioned, Herbie Nichols' parents were from the Caribbean, and they emigrated to New York during World War I. He's born in January 1919. When he was born, his family was living around 51st, which had been a traditional black community. In fact, a lot of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders were black, came from that particular neighborhood. But in the 1920s, Irish New Yorkers made life difficult for black New Yorkers, and there was a big migration up to Harlem, which is where Nichols grew up. At age 9, he began studying classical piano. His parents were determined he was not going to be a jazz guy, he'd be a classical music guy, and that training continues all the way through his teen years. Around age 18 in 1937, he gets his first paying gig playing music with Freddie Williams' band, the Royal Barons. Even though he was only 18, he'd had a robust musical education, and so he began to do arrangements for the band, and he also started to write his own compositions in and around 1938 1939. The war rolls along in 1941, and he's a very early draftee. He's drafted in 1941, and he stays in the Army. There's no real detail as to what he did in the Army, but he stays in the Army until 1943 when he's demobilized, and he returns to a New York jazz scene which is, at least under the surface, gripped with the bebop phenomenon. The excitement and the improvisational nature of bebop compared to the more formulaic nature of big band swing jazz really excited Nichols, and he starts to hang around places like Monroe's Uptown House and Minton's Playhouse, the places where bebop was being born in after-hours jam sessions, including people like Thelonious Monk, whom Nichols forms a friendship with. Now, Nichols, this is kind of a theme which recurs through his history, was not the best self-promoter, and he wasn't the best at what you might call the see me, get in there and muck about and make things happen side of a jazz career. He kind of wanted life to recognize his incredible ability and talent, and life was sometimes slow to do that. And as a consequence, he's somewhat a peripheral figure, and where people like Monk start to see their careers take off, this is not happening for Nichols. For the most part, in the rest of the decade, he makes a living playing for people like Lucky Thompson and Illinois Jacquet, big bands that played standards, that got people dancing and so on, not to impugn their own musicianship, but it was not particularly cutting edge. Nichols, while he was doing this sideman bit, threw himself into composition and wrote all manner, I think something like 170 different compositions, which he, again, this is the kind of nerdy as opposed to the entrepreneurial side of the guy, religiously deposited with the Library of Congress. I think the issue has to do with marketing, because if Nichols' music is a bit quirky, Monk's was way quirkier, and yet Monk was getting gigs and was a major figure in the scene, and Nichols was not. So I do feel like Nichols' nerdy sincerity was harming his career, and in fact, maybe the best example of this is the fact that in 1946, he ends up writing a profile of Monk for a music trade magazine, which then Alfred Lyon of Blue Note Records reads and goes, "This Monk guy sounds great," and signs him to a record deal. So Monk starts recording for Blue Note in 1947. Nichols, who wants to be recording for Blue Note and is sending Alfred Lyon tape after tape after tape, doesn't actually get signed to step into the recording studio until 1955. He did cut a few tracks for Savoy Records in March 1952, but he seems to have had a hard time figuring out what he needed to do to make his career happen. And if you listen to and read the few interviews that are available, he sounds a bit, well, even passive aggressive about it. He says, you've got to be an Uncle Tom or you've got to be a drug addict to make it in the jazz world, and I'm neither one. Well, or you need to be somebody who puts yourself out there. I'm not quite sure he really was. He was too willing to take a back seat, too willing not to play the music that he was brilliant at. But eventually, as I mentioned, he does get his shot with Blue Note, and so in May 1955, he goes into the recording studio along with Al McKibben on bass and Art Blakey on drums to make both of these records within a week of each other. The two 10-inch records, which are compiled on this one release, were recorded on May the 6th and May the 13th, 1955, in Rudy Van Gelder's parents' front room in Hackensack, New Jersey, and this being a Blue Note recording. Of course, Alfred Lyon is a producer. Nichols is on piano. The famous Art Blakey, although he wasn't that famous then, because this is still kind of pre-Jazz Messengers, is on drums. And Al McKibben is on bass. And McKibben was a prolific sideman, really from the bebop era on. With those two 10-inch records released, Nichols then follows this up in 1956 with another record for Blue Note called the Herbie Nichols Trio, which has actually got Max Roach sitting in on drums. So he didn't lack high-quality sidemen and well-connected friends. And he also gets a bit of a break, too, in 1956 because Billie Holiday hears his song Serenade, which was an instrumental, and there are some lyrics written, and then she records it, and it becomes the song Lady Sings the Blues, which, of course, is one of her signature songs and a huge hit. So he's pretty well set up. And then what happens after that? Practically nothing. He does one more LP, this time for Bethlehem, called, perhaps revealingly, Love, Gloom, Cash, Love. And then that's it for his recording career. He has a bit of a renaissance almost in the early 60s because his work is discovered by some real up-and-comers. People like the trombonist Roswell Rudd, who would go on to do all kinds of work with Archie Shepp, and actually Archie Shepp himself, and also Buell Neidlinger, who of course was the bassist for Cecil Taylor's cutting-edge work. So he was becoming a bit of a darling of the avant-garde in the early 1960s, but tragically he's diagnosed with leukemia, and he dies in April 1963 at the age of 44. The first track is Dance Line, and right away you're into the general feel of the record. It's very representative of the other tracks. There's a lot of similarities here to Monk, not that he's copying Monk, but you can tell there's an influence. Step Tempest, Swings Like a Mother. This is the kind of track that you play if you want to turn people onto jazz. The Third World is next, and this is one of Nichols' best performances on the record, particularly the fascinating choices he makes with his left hand, which is typically, obviously, the rhythm and piano. It's not all rhythm. It's like some kind of alternative narrative to the melody. Anyway, really, really great track. Very interesting. Blue Chopsticks is next. It's a busy little number, some great fills by Blakey. Blakey's role in this record is very interesting. He's more subdued on side one. He's a bigger presence on side two. His solos don't occur when you might expect solos to occur, and sometimes, actually in a number of cases, they're used to end tracks, but not in the way that you're anticipating. Anyway, it's fascinating, and I think quite effective. Double Exposure has a nice solo from McKibben, but I would say, career-wise, and actually on here too, the greater strength is his comping. Cro-Magnon Nights is another highlight, and again, it's Nichols' work with his left hand that's the most fascinating piece. Now we're on to side two, which, as I mentioned, is where Blakey is really versatile and amazing and tasteful, which is not always the case when he's a leader. Amoeba's Dance is the first track, and I think Rudy has done something a little bit different with the mics and the knobs and whatever else, because the drums, if anything, sound even better, even crisper than they did on side one. Crisp Day is almost like a rag, almost like a Joplin-ish kind of feeling track. 2300 Skidoo is next, and this is one of the more famous tracks to come off these records. This is all about Nichols and about the really interesting choices this time he's making with the melody lines. And the same can be said for the next track, It Didn't Happen. And at this point in the record, you're thinking to yourself, how is it this guy is not more famous? How is it this guy is being exhumed as a retrospective hero as opposed to somebody who ought to have been famous in his time? Because this is fantastic music. Shuffle Montgomery is another one of those tracks which is ended somewhat arbitrarily by Blakey, but again, to good effect. The final track is Brass Rings, a really cool solo on toms by Blakey here, and McKibben also has some really nice comping. You know, sometimes people are rescued from obscurity and celebrated, and after a while of them being rescued and celebrated, you listen to their music, you think, you know, I kind of understand why they were obscure in the first place. I think that a little bit about that guy Rodriguez, the folk singer who was the subject of Searching for Sugar Man. Sorry, any Rodriguez fans. That's not the case with Nichols. He's a fascinating writer, a fascinating performer, and not like anybody else in your collection. There's not quite enough variety here to say this is a perfect record, but it's an essential addition to anybody's 1950s jazz collection. For me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.